Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. Today we're tearing down the one-dimensional Viking stereotype and diving into the raw, layered mindset of the Norse, where warriors prayed, priests made peace, and nothing was ever as simple as it looked. What if the Vikings weren't just axe-swinging maniacs drunk on mead and bloodlust? What if they were also philosophers, thinkers navigating a brutal world with sharp minds as well as sharp blades? What if Norse society wasn't primitive, but layered, not frozen in time, but constantly adapting? That's what we're diving into today, because the more you study the Norse, the clearer it becomes. They were never simple. Their world was violent, yes, but it was also full of choices, values, contradictions, and evolving ways of thinking. This ain't about turning them into saints or savages. It's about recognizing them as people, real, messy, thinking, feeling people. For a long time, historians leaned heavy on anthropology to decode the Viking age. They boiled the Norse mind down to a few traits: honor, loyalty, bloodlines. But reality's never that neat. The sources, sagas, laws, and church records tell a story. But they were often written by elites, pushing an ideal, not raw truth, not what actually happened in the longhouses, on the farms, in the feasting halls, or out on the battlefields. So to understand the Viking mind, we have to read between the lines. We pull from archaeology, oral history, court documents, and the contradictions buried inside the sagas themselves. Let's start where most people think the Norse begin and end: violence. We all know the image: a Viking with a blood-soaked axe, howling revenge for a fallen brother. And yeah, blood-taking was real. Honor mattered. Vengeance wasn't just allowed, it was expected. But here's what gets missed: so was peacemaking, and not as some weak coward's way out, but as a powerful, sacred act. To end a feud, you didn't just say sorry. You gave land. You paid silver. You offered your child in fosterage. You arranged a marriage to bind two feuding clans. Blood-taking and peacemaking weren't opposites. They were both tools, two blades in the same warrior's belt. And the decision between them? That came down to status, class, reputation. An Icelandic freeman might work through negotiation and mediation. A Norwegian noble schooled in royal politics might choose diplomacy. But a landless young man with nothing to lose, sometimes violence was his only shot at getting noticed. See, Norse ethics weren't about law the way we think of law today. They were relational. It wasn't about what rules were broken. It was about how a person responded to being wronged. That was the test. That was the code. And here's where it gets deeper, because it wasn't just violence and peace. It was the gods themselves, battling for space inside the Norse mind. When Christianity came in, it didn't burn Odin out of memory. It didn't sweep the old ways away in one clean purge. It layered itself on top. You'd find men carving runes invoking Thor on their ship keels, then going to Mass on Sunday. Women would baptize their babies and still leave offerings for the landvetir, the local spirits. This wasn't confusion. It was adaptation. The Norse didn't abandon the old world. They wove it into the new one. And just like with conflict, class shaped religion too. To a warrior, Christ was a conquering king, another warlord god to kneel before. To a farmer, he was a provider, blessing crops and animals. To an outlaw, maybe he was a god of mercy, a shot at redemption when the old gods turned their backs. Christianity didn't arrive as one solid block. It shattered into 1,000 local interpretations, reshaped by the people who lived it. The church tried to bring order, but the people brought nuance. And the clergy? They weren't just enforcing dogma, they became mediators. They stepped in during feuds. They offered prayers instead of payback. They gave chieftains a path to keep their honor without more bloodshed. Picture a Norse lord. His brother's just been killed. The feud calls for blood. But the priest steps in, not to kill the old ways, but to expand them. He offers penance, a path of peace that still feels like vengeance. That's evolution, not replacement, addition. Same thing happened with marriage. We've all heard it. Viking marriages were loveless contracts arranged for land and alliances. And that was true, at first. But over time, you start to see something shift. Consent, affection, emotional connection. Not because the church demanded it, but because people started living that way. Young couples wanted more than property deals. Parents started listening when a son or daughter said no. Yeah, the old system stayed in place, but love began to sneak in alongside strategy. This is what the Viking mind did. It layered. It didn't throw out the old to make room for the new. It adapted, negotiated, made room for both. A woman could honor her ancestors and say Christian prayers. A warrior could dream of Valhalla and still fear hell. A child could be raised on Odin's tales, but confirmed by a bishop. And none of that meant they were confused. It meant they were human. That's the core of this whole thing. Mentalities. Not just what people did, but how they thought. Anthropologists used to flatten it out, say all Norse people lived by the same handful of values. But look closer, and it's not that simple. The real power of Norse society was in how people interpreted those values. Honor meant one thing to a chieftain, another to a widow in a fishing village. Loyalty could bind men to their king, or drive them to betray him for a higher code. Even the sagas, the great written memory of the Norse world, weren't just history. They were reflections, arguments, stories that remembered the past while reshaping it. Read Njál's saga, and you don't just get a tale of blood and law. You get a deep dive into a society struggling with what justice means, when vengeance goes too far, when honor demands too much. Read Laxdæla saga, and you see women maneuvering in a world not built for them, finding space, finding voice, finding power in the cracks. These weren't just war stories. They were mirrors, tools, blueprints for how to be Norse in a world that was always changing, because change didn't come from above. It came from the ground up, from farmers, warriors, women, priests, children, each of them navigating pressures, customs, values, and making choices. Some held on to the old gods, some embraced the new. Most lived in the space between. They weren't passive. They weren't brainwashed. They were thinkers. They were survivors. And maybe that's the lesson. The Norse weren't contradictions. They were complexity made flesh. They could fight and pray, burn down a monastery and still baptize their kids. If Heimdall could be a watchman and a warrior. If Odin could rule through fear and chase knowledge. If a Viking could light a candle in church and still whisper to Thor in a storm, then maybe we've had it backwards all along. Maybe complexity isn't a weakness. Maybe it's what makes us strong.